You a sniper, that's adorable. The laughter hit the ceiling before he finished the sentence. 8 operators, all of them decorated, all of them certain. Brooke Callahan didn't flinch, didn't blink. She put her coffee down on the like she was setting down a weapon she hadn't decided to use yet. And then she looked Commander Grant Holloway directly in the eyes and said it. 4 words, barely above a whisper. Ask who took Kestrel. The laughter died mid-breath. Holloway's entire body went rigid. His face, the face of a man who had survived 3 combat deployments and never once lost his composure in front of his team, drained of every certainty he had walked in with. Because Kestrel was sealed at the highest classification level, because the shooter's identity had never been released, because the only people who knew that name were the 9 men whose lives depended on that shot. And one of them was sitting in this room right now laughing at her. Subscribe now and tell me your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches. The briefing room at Falcon Ridge Naval Warfare Annex smelled like burnt coffee and testosterone, which Brooke Callahan had decided was the unofficial fragrance of every military space she had ever entered. The chairs were hard, the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that gave lesser people headaches, and the men already seated when she walked in had been talking about her before she ever opened the door. She knew this because they stopped the moment she entered, the way people only stop talking when the subject of the conversation has just arrived. She was used to it. She had been used to it for a long time. Brooke set her gear bag down beside the chair at the far left of the table. The seat. Nobody had claimed the one closest to the door, the one that announced to everyone present that she did not expect to be welcomed, and she sat down without making eye contact with anyone. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and uncapped a pen. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She waited. Chief Nolan Price noticed her from across the room. He was 45 years of carefully maintained muscle and deliberate stillness, the kind of man who had turned his physical presence into a professional tool, and he wore his seniority the way some men wear medals, visibly, constantly making certain everyone in the room registered the weight of it. He looked at Brooke the way a homeowner looks at a crack in a wall they did not expect to find. Annoying. Possibly nothing. Possibly everything. But not yet worth genuine alarm. Petty Officer Dylan Ward was 26 and had not yet learned to hide what he was thinking. He glanced at Brooke, then at Nolan, then back at Brooke, and the sequence of those glances told her everything about where his loyalties were going to fall when this room required him to choose. He was not cruel. He was simply young, and young men in rooms full of older men tend to borrow their opinions until they develop the experience to grow their own. Commander Grant Holloway walked in at 0800 exactly, which Brooke had already noted was his habit. A man who is 5 minutes early to everything is a man who needs to feel that he arrived before the situation did. Holloway was 46, broad through the shoulders, with gray threaded through dark hair, and the particular set of jaw that comes from years of making decisions in conditions where wrong decisions get people killed. He had a record that justified his confidence. Brooke had read every line of it. She respected what was in those pages. She had no intention of letting that respect silence her. Holloway moved to the front of the room without acknowledging her. He dropped a folder on the table. The table scanned the faces of his operators, and then his gaze arrived at Brooke and did what she expected it to do. It stopped, assessed, made a conclusion. Lieutenant Callahan. He said her name like a question that already had an answer he found unsatisfying. Commander, she said. Medical and rescue background. Among other things, she said. That was when Nolan Price leaned back in his chair and said it. Casually. almost gently, way experienced men deliver cruelty when they have decided it does not technically count as cruelty. You're telling me Command sent us a combat medic to fill a precision shooter slot? He was not asking Holloway. He was asking the room. What's next? They sending us a cook? The laughter started low and built. It moved through the room like a wave, and Brooke watched it travel, counted the faces that joined it, noted the ones that hesitated. Dylan Ward laughed. He caught himself half a second too late, and the sound had already left his body. Two other operators she had not yet learned the names of laughed freely, the way men laugh when they are certain they are on the correct side of something. Holloway did not laugh, but he did not stop it either. He let it run its course, and then he looked at Brooke with an expression that was somehow worse than amusement. It was patience. The patience of a man who has already decided this will be a brief administrative inconvenience before things return to normal. "Lieutenant," he said, "I'm sure your record in field medicine is exceptional. What concerns me is how a medical officer ends up assigned to one of the Navy's precision shooter units with a file that lists approximately 4 live-fire combat engagements and a set of marksmanship scores that are—" He paused, opened the folder, tilted his head slightly. "Good, but not exceptional." "That file is not complete," Brooke said. "I'm reading what's in front of me." "I know what's in front of you," she said. "Some of what I've done is sealed." More laughter. Softer this time, but more dangerous because this kind carried disbelief in it. Nolan Price set both hands flat on the table. "Commander, I want to be respectful here, so I'm going to say this carefully. If Command is using this unit to make a statement about inclusion and diversity initiatives, I understand the political pressure. But we run real operations. We don't have the margin to carry someone who isn't at the level this team requires." The room went quiet in a different way after that. Even Dylan Ward stopped moving. Brooke put her pen down. She looked at Nolan directly for the first time. "How many rounds have you fired this month, Chief?" Nolan blinked. "That's not relevant." "It's deeply relevant," she said pleasantly, "because you're talking about whether I can shoot, and I'm curious whether your opinion is coming from professional experience or from the fact that I walked through that door and you decided in the first 4 seconds. I've been doing this for 17 years, Nolan said, and his voice had dropped a register which Brooke recognized as the sound a man makes when he suddenly realizes he is in an actual conversation rather than a performance. "I know," she said. "I read your file on the drive over." Holloway set down his folder. "Lieutenant Callahan, I'm going to be direct. Your assignment here was not my recommendation. The orders came from above my pay grade, and I don't have the authority to reverse them without cause. But I also have a responsibility to this team, and that responsibility requires me to evaluate every operator according to the same standard. If you're here, you earn your place. You don't arrive with it." "Understood," Brooke said. "I intend to run you through a full evaluation, 3 days. Desert conditions, live wind variable terrain, no assists. You perform at the level this team requires, you have a slot here. You perform at anything less. I'll write the recommendation that sends you back to wherever Command thinks you came from, and I'll fight the political blowback myself. Are we clear?" "Clear," she said. "Good." He moved on. He pulled a map from the folder and turned to the rest of the room and began the operational briefing as though the last 3 minutes had been a minor scheduling note rather than a declaration of war. Brooke picked up her pen and went back to her notebook. Nolan Price watched her from across the table with the particular attention of a man who has just realized that the quiet person in the corner might be more trouble than they first appeared. Not because he respected her yet, but because something in her stillness made him uncertain, and he was not accustomed to feeling uncertain about things he had already decided. The briefing covered regional threat assessments, Updated intelligence on a maritime smuggling network operating through the Red Sea corridor and preliminary mission planning for a potential hostage extraction. Brooke listened to every word and wrote nothing down after the date at the top of her page. She had already committed it to memory. She always did. After Holloway dismissed the room, Dylan Ward passed her on his way out and almost said something. She could see it in his posture, that reaching motion people make when a word is halfway to their mouth before they pull it back. He did not say it. He followed Nolan out the door instead. She did not hold it against him. Holloway stopped at the doorway and turned back. The room was empty except for the two of them. He looked at her for a long moment. "Kestrel," he said quietly. "Where did you hear that name?" "I was there," she said. Holloway's hand tightened on the door frame. Not much, just enough for her to see it. "That operation is sealed at the highest classification level. I know. The shooter's identity is unreleased." "I know that too." He stared at her for several seconds. Something shifted in his face, not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle recalibration. The expression of a man who has just realized that the map he was using might be wrong, and he is not yet ready to admit how wrong. "Get your gear ready for 0600 tomorrow," he said. "First evaluation begins at first light." He left. Brooke sat in the empty room for another 2 minutes. She thought about Calvin Ross, which she always did when she entered a room full of people who had already decided what she was. She thought about his voice on the radio, calm even then, giving her wind corrections while the world around them was coming apart. She thought about the weight of him afterward, how he was always heavier than she expected, which was something nobody told you about carrying the people you lost, that they weigh more coming home than they did going out. She put the notebook in her pocket. She picked up her gear bag. She walked out into the Nevada heat and started preparing for the morning. The evaluation began before sunrise, which was Holloway's way of establishing the terms from the opening second. The drive to the range took 40 minutes over roads that were barely roads, and Brooke sat in the back of the vehicle, while Nolan and 2 other operators talked about a range they had worked the previous month, speaking with the easy authority of men who belong to a place and want that belonging confirmed regularly. Dylan sat beside Brooke, but angled toward the window. She did not try to start a conversation. The range itself was a series of elevated platforms set against a terrain that had been specifically chosen for its difficulty. The salt flats created optical distortions in the heat, even in the early morning. Wind came from 3 different directions, depending on where you were standing. The targets were set at distances ranging from 400 to over 900 yards, some partially obscured by terrain features, some exposed but surrounded by reflective surface conditions that made standard range finding unreliable. Holloway laid out the evaluation structure in 5 sentences. Accuracy over time. Performance under pressure. Execution in non-standard conditions. Communication with a spotter. Decision-making when the environment contradicts the equipment. The other 2 shooters went first. They performed well. Not perfectly, but well within the margins that experienced operators typically achieved. Nolan served as range observer calling corrections with the precise efficiency of 17 years of practice. He was very good. Brooke had already known he would be. The file she had read on the drive over had not understated him. Her turn came mid-morning, when the heat was beginning to build, and the light off the salt flats was throwing false readings across every standard rangefinder in the kit. She settled into position called her spotter, a young operator named Reyes, who had been assigned to her for the evaluation, and began her first target sequence. She did not fire. Reyes waited. Then he cleared his throat quietly. "Wind is from the northwest at approximately 11 knots, she said. Salt reflection is giving the rangefinder a reading of 612 yards on target 3. Actual distance is closer to 680. I can calculate it manually, or we can wait for a cloud to kill the reflection. But if I fire on the equipment reading, I'll miss by roughly 1.5 feet at that distance. Reyes looked at his rangefinder. He looked at it again. It's reading 612, he said. I know what it's reading, she said. The reading is wrong. From the observer position, Nolan's voice came back flat and professional. Lieutenant Callahan, you are currently not firing during your evaluation window. The equipment reads 612. The equipment is wrong, Chief. A pause. If you are declining to fire because you believe you'll miss, that is a different kind of problem than a miscalibrated rangefinder. I'm not declining to fire, she said, and her voice was completely level. I'm declining to fire on incorrect data. If you want to give me 30 seconds, I will give you the correct number. Another pause. Longer. 30 seconds, Holloway said from somewhere behind the line. She pulled no additional equipment. She used shadow length from a fixed post at the edge of the salt flat, cross-referenced it against the heat shimmer pattern above the target, and calculated against the observed wind deflection on a piece of loose material she had noticed tied to a stake near the 500-yard marker when the vehicle drove past that morning. The calculation took 22 seconds. Target 3 is at 683 yards, she said. Wind correction adds approximately 4.2 inches left at that distance in current conditions. The scope reads 612, so the correction point is visually counterintuitive. I want to note this before I fire, so no one in the observer position is surprised by the adjustment. She fired. The target fell. She moved immediately to target 4. Same issue. She called it again without hesitation, recalculated in under 20 seconds, fired. Target 4 fell. Target 5 followed. Behind the line, nobody was talking. Then she heard it, not dramatic, not a gasp, but the particular quality of silence that happens when a group of experienced people have just seen something they did not expect and are working out how to process it without showing on their faces that they are doing exactly that. Nolan's voice came back on the radio. Carefully. What method were you using for the distance correction? Shadow to height ratio on the fixed post, she said, cross-referenced against the heat drift pattern and observed wind deflection from the survey stake at the 500 marker. It's a field calculation, not equipment, just terrain reading. You noticed a survey stake, Nolan said. I notice most things, she said. After the morning session, the group broke for water in the shade of the vehicles. Dylan Ward appeared at her elbow while she was refilling her bottle. He did not look at her directly. He watched the middle distance the way young men do when they are trying to seem casual about something they are actually nervous to say. That was, he started. Accurate, she said, because she did not want to let him say something generous and then watch him walk it back when Nolan came within earshot. Yeah, he said. It was. She finished filling her bottle. You're running a suppressor on you that isn't properly seated. I noticed it when you were pulling equipment this morning. You should check the alignment before the afternoon session. Dylan went still. What? The suppressor. Check the threading alignment. If it's off by the margin, I think it is, and you fire in the afternoon heat, you could have a problem. He stared at her. How did you check the alignment, Petty Officer Ward? He walked away and checked it. 2 minutes later, he came back with a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be frightened. It was off, he said. Not by much, but by enough, she said. He stood there for another moment. Then quietly, thank you. Don't thank me, she said. Just listen next time before you decide someone doesn't know what they're doing. He nodded. He went back to his position. He did not laugh for the rest of the day. The afternoon session ran until the light began to fail, and by the time Holloway called the end of the first evaluation day, something in the texture of the group had shifted. Not transformed, not resolved, but shifted the way ground shifts before rain, when the pressure has been building for a while, and the air finally acknowledges what it has been carrying. Nolan Price was quiet on the drive back. Brooke did not interpret this as victory. She had learned enough about men like Nolan to understand that the silence of a man who has been made to reconsider something is not the same as agreement. He was processing. He was rebuilding his assessment on new foundations, and the question was what structure it would produce when he was finished. Holloway said nothing to her directly during the drive. But at one point, when the vehicle hit a rough patch and everyone's shoulder shifted against their neighbors, he looked at her reflection in the rear window for exactly 3 seconds before he looked away. That evening alone in the temporary quarters she had been assigned, Brooke went through her kit with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She cleaned her rifle. She rechecked her environmental data from the day's session. She wrote calculations in her notebook, not because she needed to record them, but because the physical act of writing helped her organize what she had observed and what she still needed to understand about this terrain, this wind pattern, this particular set of physical conditions that she might someday need to work in when the margin for error was not an evaluation score, but a human life. She thought about Calvin again. She thought about the way he used to hum very quietly between wind calls, not actual music, just a formless tone that meant he was thinking that the calculation was still running and he would have the number in a moment. She had never told anyone about the humming because it had seemed private in a way that most things about Calvin had been private, the small, personal habits that people carry into terrible circumstances and leave behind in them. She set the notebook aside and looked at the ceiling. The next morning, Nolan Price came to find her before the briefing. He stood in the doorway of the vehicle bay while she was doing her pre-session equipment check, and for a moment he did not speak, which was unusual enough for her to register it as significant. "Those missed shots from the Morocco rotation," he said finally. 11 months ago. I logged them as wind calls." "I read the after-action," she said. "The wind calls were correct," he said. "The rangefinder was giving false readings in similar conditions to yesterday. High reflective surface heat shimmer. I couldn't figure out why my corrections weren't landing. He stopped. "I wrote it as wind error because I didn't have another explanation." "Laser rangefinders in high albedo environments require compensation," she said. "It's a known issue, not widely documented in standard training packages." "No," he said, "it's not. You're a very good sniper, Chief Price." Something moved through his expression. Not softness exactly, but the suspension of something hard that had been holding a particular shape for a long time. "That wasn't an apology," he said. I know," she said. "The apology comes later. This is just you deciding whether you want to have an actual conversation or keep performing the version of this where you're certain and I'm the question mark." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly. "The Morocco miss was the worst moment of my career. Nobody was hurt, but I had the clearest possible shot, and I missed, and I have never been able to explain it to myself." "I can explain it," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That's the problem." They looked at each other across the vehicle bay in the thin, early morning light, and Brooke understood that what was happening between them was not reconciliation, not yet, but the first honest exchange between two professionals who had stopped pretending the other person was a category rather than a person. It was not warmth, but it was the beginning of something that could become useful, and in the world Brooke Callahan had inhabited for her entire adult life, useful was where everything worth having started. She turned back to her equipment check. We have a briefing in 12 minutes. Yeah, he said. We do. He left. She finished the check. She walked into the morning. 2 days later, when Holloway finally opened the sealed section of her file, she was in the middle of her third evaluation session, firing from a position that required her to account for a crosswind that shifted direction every 45 seconds in a pattern she had spent 2 hours learning to predict. She was on the 7th target in the sequence when her radio crackled and Holloway's voice came through, and something in its texture was different from any tone she had heard from him in 3 days. Lieutenant Callahan, when you finish this sequence, I need you at the command vehicle. She finished the sequence, all targets. She walked to the command vehicle, still carrying her rifle, and Holloway was standing outside it with her file open in his hands. He had a specific look that she recognized. She had seen it on people before, not often, but enough to know it. It was the look of someone who has been telling themselves a story about a situation and has just found out that the story was wrong, and the discovery is not just embarrassing but actually painful, because the wrongness of the story has had real consequences that cannot be undone. You were there, he said. It was not a question this time. It was an acknowledgement. Yes, she said. You took the Kestrel shot. Yes. He looked down at the file. 9 men came home because of that shot. 9, Lieutenant, including me. His voice was not loud. It never got loud. But there was a quality in it that she had not heard before, a weight that had been there all along but was now visible. And after you made that shot, it says here, you carried your spotter toward the evacuation point for 200 yards under fire. He was wounded. He died. Yes, she said. His name was Calvin Ross, she said, and her voice was completely flat, which was the only way she could say it without the word changing shape in her mouth. He was my spotter for 3 years. Holloway closed the file. He stood in the Nevada heat with the sun beating down on both of them and the faint sound of the range still running in the distance. Why are you still here? He said. After what happened at Kestrel. Why are you still in the field? Because Calvin's last report asked command not to reduce me to just the medic, she said. Because I read that report 18 months ago when they finally let me see it. Because I made him a promise that I intend to keep. Holloway looked at her for a very long time. Then he put the file under his arm and straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice had the particular precision of a man choosing words with the same care he would apply to anything that needed to be done correctly. You passed, he said. All 3 evaluation standards. You passed the first day to be direct about it. I kept running the evaluation because I was not ready to say it out loud. He paused. I owe you an apology. You owe me a conversation, she said. The apology can wait. We need to talk about the intelligence brief that came in this morning on the Red Sea corridor, because there's something in the satellite imaging that doesn't line up with the facility blueprints, and I think the mission planning we have for the Doran operation has a critical gap. He blinked. For half a second, he looked almost startled. Then the commander settled back into his face, and he straightened. What gap? He said. The primary approach corridor, she said. Walk with me. I'll show you. They walked. The range ran in the background, the sound of shots rolling across the desert flats in the heat-thick air, and Brooke Callahan moved through the Nevada morning with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already been here before, not in this specific desert, not at this specific moment, but in this space between being dismissed and being trusted, this narrow and demanding ground where she had always done her best work long before anyone watching had thought to give her credit for it. The satellite image was 11 days old, which was 11 days too old, and that was the first thing Brooke told Holloway when she spread it across the hood of the command vehicle and put her finger on the northeast corner of the facility blueprint. Look at the shadow angle here, she said. This was taken at approximately 1400 hours local time. The shadow from the eastern processing tower falls northwest. But in these two frames, she pulled up two additional prints she had requested from the intelligence package that morning. Taken 4 days earlier at 0900, the shadow falls southeast, and there is a structural outline that does not appear in the blueprint. Holloway leaned in. He looked at the images the way he looked at everything, with the focused attention of a man accustomed to finding the thing that mattered in the middle of everything that didn't. Then he went still. "That's a secondary structure," he said. "It's a temporary structure," she said. "Which means Doran built it after the facility was last formally surveyed. And the assault plan that's currently on the board assumes a straight approach through the service corridor on the eastern side, which puts the entire ground team within 70 yards of whatever is in that corner of the facility." "Where's the mission planner?" Holloway said, not loudly, but with the particular edge in his voice that made the question sound like the beginning of a much larger conversation. Within 4 minutes, 3 people were standing around the hood of that vehicle, and within 8, the entire team had been pulled from the range and gathered in the shade of the operations tent, while Holloway laid out what Brooke had found. The original mission plan had been built from a combination of satellite imagery and informant intelligence, and the informant had not mentioned the secondary structure because, as they would determine later, the informant had not known it existed. Nolan Price stood with his arms crossed and looked at the images for a long time, without speaking. Then he looked at Brooke. "How long did it take you to spot this?" "40 minutes after I saw the intelligence packet this morning," she said. "This packet came in 18 hours ago," he said. "I know." I uncrossed his arms. He did not say anything else, but the posture shift was visible to everyone in the tent, and Dylan Ward, standing at the back of the group with his notebook open, watched it happen, with the expression of someone who is revising something they have been carrying around in their head without realizing how heavy it was. Holloway restructured the preliminary mission framework over the next 2 hours, and for the first time since Brooke had walked into the briefing room at Falcon Ridge, she was included in the planning conversation not as a subject of evaluation, but as a voice at the table. It was a subtle difference to an outside observer. To everyone in that tent, it was not subtle at all. The intelligence on Dr. Naomi Vale had come through a State Department back channel 3 weeks earlier, and it had been building in detail and urgency ever since. Naomi was 43, a communications infrastructure engineer who had been on a contracted project for a regional maritime authority when Doran's network had taken her from a hotel in Djibouti. The reason for her capture was not ransom. Naomi had spent 11 months building a proprietary communications encryption system that, if unlocked, would give whoever held the access codes a window into approximately 40% of the maritime traffic coordination signals running through the Red Sea corridor. Doran wanted those codes. He had been patient about obtaining them, which was what made him genuinely dangerous, rather than merely violent. Patient men with resources and a specific goal were the kind of problem that did not resolve itself through standard operational pressure. "She's been held for 22 days, Holloway told the group. "Our intel suggests she hasn't given them the primary access sequence, but she's not going to hold indefinitely. Nobody does." Brooke thought about that for a moment. 22 days was a long time to hold something under that kind of pressure. It told her something about Naomi Vale, that the file did not cover directly, something about the quality of her will, and she filed it carefully alongside everything else she was assembling, about a woman she had never met but was beginning to know in the way. You know a person when their survival depends on decisions you are making in a room far away from where they are. The afternoon session had been designed as a continuation of her evaluation, a practical exercise simulating hostage environment shooting conditions, but Holloway called it differently now. It was no longer framed as her evaluation. It was framed as mission preparation. The distinction was small in words and enormous in everything else. Nolan was her assigned spotter for the afternoon exercise. He did not ask for the role. Holloway assigned it, and Nolan accepted it with a nod that was too controlled to be casual, which told Brooke he had feelings about it, that he was choosing not to express through his face. She respected that. She had the same capacity herself. They climbed to the elevated position together in silence for the first 4 minutes. Then Nolan said, "The Morocco miss. You said you could explain it. I want to hear the explanation." "Now," she said. "We have time while we climb," he said. She thought for a moment about how to frame it. Not because she was uncertain of the information, but because she understood that the way information lands matters as much as the information itself, and Nolan Price was a man who had been carrying a professional failure for 11 months and deserved to receive its explanation with the same precision he brought to his work. High-albedo surface conditions salt flats in Morocco's case, a combination of coastal salt crust and reflective building materials in the target area, create a specific rangefinder error pattern, she said. The laser returns faster than it should because it's bouncing off the reflective layer before it reaches the actual target surface. The equipment shows you a shorter distance. You compensate for wind and elevation based on a shorter distance than you're actually firing at, and your shot lands short of true by a margin that looks like wind error, because wind error is the only explanation that makes intuitive sense in the moment. Nolan climbed for a moment without responding. "That is exactly what happened," he said in a voice that was quiet enough that she had to listen carefully to hear it over their footing on the terrain. "I know," she said. "I spent 4 months going over my wind calculation," he said. "I reviewed every variable. I pulled meteorological data from a 3-hour window around the shot. I could not find the error." "Because the error wasn't in your calculation," she said. "It was in the data you were calculating with." He stopped climbing. She stopped beside him. He was looking at the terrain ahead, but she understood he was not seeing terrain. "I told myself I was slipping," he said. 17 years in, and I thought maybe I'd finally hit the wall where the instincts start to go. I started running extra range sessions. I changed my pre-shot routine. He stopped. He started climbing again. "I considered requesting a lateral transfer out of the precision role." Brooke said nothing for a moment. Then, "You would have transferred out of the thing you do best because of a rangefinder error in a salt environment." "I didn't know that's what it was," he said. "I know," she said. "Now you do." He did not thank her. She had not expected him to. But something in the quality of his silence changed as they climbed the remaining distance to the overwatch position, and when they settled into the firing setup, and he began calling his first wind correction. The voice he used was a degree more present than it had been all day, less armored in a way that made it paradoxically more precise. "Northwest at 9 knots, he said. "Temperature reading is consistent with yesterday afternoon. No salt reflection at this angle. We're looking across the shadow side of the ridge, so the rangefinder should be accurate." "Confirmed," she said. "Walking the first target." They worked through the afternoon exercise with the kind of concentrated efficiency that is only possible between two people who have stopped spending energy on anything other than the task. It was not warmth yet. It was professional alignment, which in the context of what they were preparing for was worth more than warmth anyway. Dylan Ward was running the ground support role in the exercise coordinating between the overwatch position and the simulated assault element below. He was good at it in a way that surprised her, not because she had underestimated him entirely, but because the skill he showed in the communication role was quieter and more instinctive than she had expected from someone who had been so quick to borrow other people's judgments that morning. At a pause between target sequences, she keyed her radio. "Ward, your timing on the breach call was off by 4 seconds in the 3rd sequence." A short silence. I was waiting for confirmation from the East Corridor team. You had confirmed movement on the primary target, she said. The 4-second wait put you in the breach window after the simulated guard rotation would have completed. You would have had eyes on you. Another silence longer. You clocked that from the overwatch position. I clock everything from the overwatch position, she said. 4 seconds is 4 seconds. Adjust. Yes, Lieutenant, he said, and his voice did not carry resentment. It carried attention, which was the more useful of the two options. Nolan gave her a sideways look from his spotting position. She did not look back at him, because she was already walking the next target, but she heard something in his breathing pattern that might have been the beginning of a laugh he decided not to complete, and she found it did not bother her. The exercise concluded at 17:30. Holloway ran the debrief himself, which was not his standard practice. Normally, he delegated the post-exercise review to the senior operator on scene. The fact that he ran it personally told everyone in the room that the day had produced something he wanted to address directly. I went through the exercise sequence by sequence, and when he reached the third phase, the breach coordination failure that Brooke had called out on the radio, he stopped on it for almost 3 full minutes. He asked Dylan to walk through his decision timeline, listened to the explanation without interruption, and then said something that Brooke had not heard a commander say in approximately 6 years. Petty Officer Ward, you waited for confirmation when the primary confirmation was already in your hand. Why? Dylan thought about it. He actually thought about it, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. And when he answered, his voice had the particular quality of someone saying something true rather than something acceptable. I was waiting for someone else to tell me what I already knew, he said. I didn't trust my own read of the situation. Why not? Holloway said. Dylan hesitated. Then, because I've been in situations where I was wrong, and the consequences were visible to everyone. I defaulted to waiting because waiting felt safer than being wrong again. Holloway nodded slowly. 4 seconds felt like safety. In a live scenario, it would have been exposure. He looked around the room. This is how people die. Not from being wrong. From being so afraid of being wrong that they stop trusting the information they actually have. The room was quiet. Brooke looked at her notebook. She was thinking about how she had carried Calvin Ross 200 yards in the dark, and how every step of those 200 yards she had been telling herself, she should have seen the ambush earlier. She should have read the terrain differently. She should have trusted the particular wrongness she had felt looking at that approach corridor and said something before they were already inside it. She had been so certain that her uncertainty was the source of his death, that it had taken her 4 years to consider the possibility that her certainty, when it finally arrived, had saved 9 other people from the same outcome. After the debrief, she walked the perimeter of the operations area alone. This was a habit she had developed years ago, not as a security measure, but as a way of processing the day's information, of letting her mind run through everything she had observed without the pressure of being watched while it did. She thought better when she was moving, and she moved best when there was no one around whose expectations she was also carrying. Nolan found her on the east side of the perimeter, where the terrain dropped slightly before opening into the flat darkness of the desert floor. He stood beside her for a moment before he spoke. Holloway read your complete file today, he said. I assumed he would, she said. He came out of the command tent looking like a man who had just found out he'd been sitting in the wrong chair for 3 days, Nolan said. Which is, he paused. That's not an easy look to sit with. No, she said. He's a good commander, Nolan said, and she understood that this was not a defense of Holloway. It was an honest assessment delivered by someone who was trying to be fair. He makes assumptions, but he acts on evidence when it's in front of him. That's rarer than it sounds. I know it is, she said. The Kestrel shot, Nolan said. He said it carefully, the way you handle something you are not sure belongs to you. That was a 700-yard shot through a dust storm. 682, she said. And it was a particulate suspension, not a full storm. There's a difference in the visual distortion pattern. He looked at her. You corrected me on the dust storm. It matters for the calculation, she said. Of course it does, he said almost to himself. He looked back out at the dark terrain. I would not have taken that shot, he said. I want to be honest with you. I am very good at what I do, and I would not have taken that shot. Not with those conditions, not at that distance, not with a live shooter on the roof of the building to my left. Calvin spotted for me, she said. He was hit 30 seconds after I fired. He gave me the final correction, and then he was down and I was carrying him and the shot was already in the air. Nolan went very still. He knew, she said. He knew where the shooter on the roof was, and he gave me the correction anyway because he knew what would happen to Holloway's team if I missed. He made a choice. I carry that choice with me every day, and I carry the weight of not having made a different one. But I am done using that weight as a reason to stop doing the thing Calvin gave everything to make possible. Nolan Price said nothing for a long time. The desert was very quiet around them, the way deserts are at night when the heat has finally released its grip, and the air settles into something almost generous. I owe you an apology, he said finally. I told Holloway the apology could wait, she said. I'm not Holloway, he said. She looked at him. Something in his face was stripped down, the professional surface set aside, showing the person who lived inside all that considered careful competence. I made assumptions, he said. I made them in the first 4 seconds, and I dressed them up as professional concern, and I said them in front of the whole room because I knew that if I said them publicly, nobody would ask me to defend them. That's not something I'm proud of. Brooke was quiet for a moment. I don't need your admiration, Chief Price, she said. I need you to stop deciding what people can do before you give them a fair chance to show you. That's it. That's the whole thing. He nodded. I can do that. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. She turned and walked back toward the operations tent, and he fell into step beside her, without being invited, which she decided to interpret as the beginning of a professional understanding, rather than a social presumption. It was a fine line. She had always been good at fine lines. The mission briefing update came in at 2100 hours, when most of the team had moved to the evening rest period and the operations tent held only Holloway, the intelligence liaison, and 2 senior operators. Brooke was already there when the new packet arrived, which she had arranged by the simple method of not leaving. She had stayed at the planning table with her notebook and her coffee and her quiet persistence, and nobody had told her to go, because Holloway had stopped telling her to go approximately 7 hours earlier. The update changed the operational picture significantly. New satellite imaging requested by Holloway that afternoon in response to Brooke's analysis showed not just the secondary structure, but a pattern of vehicle movement around the facility's western approach that had not been visible in earlier imagery. The pattern suggested a secondary holding location within the facility complex. 2 structures instead of 1. 2 potential locations for Naomi Vale. He's been moving her, Holloway said. Regularly. Which means he either knows we're coming, or he's standard practicing against the possibility. Or both, Brooke said. Doran's profile suggests operational caution as a baseline rather than as a reaction to specific intelligence. He moves the asset because he always moves the asset, not because of us. That's actually more complicated, the intelligence liaison said. Yes, Brooke said. It is. Because it means we can't predict her location from surveillance of his routine. We have to predict it from his psychology. He will put her in the location that best serves his exit strategy, not his security perimeter. He's not thinking about holding her. He's thinking about leaving with her. Holloway looked at the new imaging. The cargo vessel, he said. Has to be, she said. She's valuable to him in motion, not in position. He needs her codes when he has access to the communication infrastructure, not when he's sitting in an abandoned desalination plant, in the middle of a Red Sea corridor. He's going to the ship. He's going to make her give him the codes in transit when there is no fixed extraction option. The intelligence liaison pulled up the maritime data. Shipping movement in the corridor. There's a vessel flagged as a commercial freight carrier, Panamanian registration, that's been holding position approximately 8 nautical miles offshore for 6 days. That's unusual for a commercial carrier. "That's his exit," Nolan said from the tent entrance. He had followed them in at some point without anyone marking it. "He's been staged for 6 days. He was waiting for her to break." "She hasn't broken," Brooke said. "No," Holloway said. "She hasn't." Something passed through the tent. Then a recognition that ran through every person present without any of them naming it directly. They were talking about a woman who had been held for 22 days under conditions designed to make her hand over something that would cause immeasurable damage in the hands of the wrong people. And she had not done it. Whatever Naomi Vale was made of it was something worth the effort of going to get her. "When does the vessel leave?" Holloway said. The liaison checked the maritime data. Based on the holding pattern and corridor traffic coordination, the most likely departure window is 72 hours from now. Outside of that, the seasonal current shift makes the approach from the south significantly more difficult for a vessel that size. 72 hours, Holloway said. "Which means we plan and execute in 60 in," Brooke said. Holloway looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted from the morning's calculation into something more direct, less mediated by whatever he had been managing between his professional assessment and his discomfort at having been wrong about her. He looked at her the way he would look at any operator who had earned a place at a planning table. Not warmly, not apologetically, professionally, which was the only thing she had ever wanted from him. "Walk me through your approach," he said. She turned to the map. The Red Sea facility sat on a coastal bluff above an abandoned port, and the physical approach required a water insertion from the north combined with an overwatch position on the elevated terrain to the east. The east approach was difficult. Exposed reflective surface conditions, heat distortion, wind interference from the coastal terrain. She had been building a picture of it in her mind since she first saw the satellite imagery, and now she laid it out point by point, distance by distance, the specific challenges and the specific solutions. When she finished, the tent was quiet. "You've been planning this all day," Nolan said. It was not an accusation. It was, she thought, the closest thing to admiration he had offered her, yet delivered in his particular way through observation rather than praise. "I plan everything I might need," she said. "It's a habit." "It's a good habit," Holloway said. He picked up the red marker and began circling the approach points on the map and the motion of it, the simple fact of him taking her analysis and making it part of the operational plan made something in the air of that tent settle, in a way she had not felt since she walked into the Falcon Ridge briefing room 3 days earlier. Outside the tent, the Nevada desert held its nighttime silence, and 60 feet away, Dylan Ward was sitting on the hood of the second vehicle, his notebook open on his knee, writing something that Brooke would later discover was a set of questions he had decided he needed to ask, rather than the answers he had previously assumed he already had. The mission clock had started. They had 60 hours to make a plan work in conditions that did not cooperate with plans. And Brooke Callahan, sitting at the planning table with her coffee and her notebook, and the particular stillness that had always been the thing she did, while everyone around her was still deciding what she was already 3 steps ahead of the problem. She always was. She just had not always had a room full of people willing to follow her there. The insertion window opened at 0230 hours, and the Red Sea was not cooperative. Brooke had known it would not be. The pre-mission meteorological data had given them a surface wind of 12 to 14 knots from the southwest, which was workable, But the coastal terrain around the facility created a compression effect that accelerated the wind through the approach corridor by an estimated 30 to 40%. She had noted this in her planning brief 2 days earlier at Falcon Ridge. She had drawn the airflow diagram by hand on the whiteboard and explained the physics of it in terms that assumed intelligence rather than patience, and Holloway had listened and incorporated it into the approach timing. What the meteorological data had not accounted for, because meteorological data rarely accounts for the specific personality of a coastline until you are physically inside, it was the secondary turbulence coming off the port's abandoned crane infrastructure. The cranes were large, and they were rusted, and they interrupted the wind in patterns that were not predictable from satellite imagery or briefing room math. Brooke felt it the moment the insertion craft rounded the breakwater, the way the air changed character above her, and she keyed her radio immediately. Overwatch team, be advised. Wind pattern in the crane corridor is complex. Do not trust single-point readings. We need continuous updates every 90 seconds, not every 3 minutes. Acknowledge. Nolan's voice came back from the Overwatch approach position on the eastern ridge. He and Brooke were moving separately. He was ascending from the north side of the ridge, while she took the direct water approach with the main team, intending to reach the Overwatch position from the facility side after the ground element was in position. It was a deviation from the original plan, her deviation, and Holloway had spent 40 minutes the night before questioning it before Brooke walked him through the sightline geometry 3 times, and he finally agreed that her angle provided coverage the north approach Overwatch position could not. Acknowledged, Nolan said. Moving to secondary wind marker position now. I'll have a continuous read for you. Good, she said. The ground team Holloway, Dylan Ward, and 4 other operators moved through the lower port structure, while Brooke broke off toward the Overwatch position. She was alone for this section of the approach, 40 yards of exposed terrain between the water's edge and the base of the ridge, and she covered it in the particular way she had learned to move when being seen would be the end of something low-controlled, each footfall, chosen with the attention most people bring only to decisions that feel important, not to decisions that simply are important. She reached the base of the ridge and began climbing. Her earpiece carried the team's position updates in a steady rhythm. The ground element was moving. Dylan was on point and calling his clearances with the measured precision she had been pushing him toward in the Nevada training sessions. She heard him pause at a junction, heard him breathe, heard him call the clear with a confidence that was different from 3 days earlier, grounded in observation rather than borrowed from the nearest senior person. She noted it while she climbed and filed it beside everything else she was tracking simultaneously. At 0318 hours, Nolan's voice changed. It was a small change, a degree of tightness that was not quite alarm, but was not routine either. She caught it immediately. I have the continuous wind read, he said. I also have something I did not expect. Talk to me, she said, still climbing. There is a thermal column rising from the area behind the secondary structure, significant enough to affect any shot with a downward trajectory component. This is not in the environmental brief. Thermal source. I don't know yet. Could be residual heat from whatever they're running in the secondary structure. Could be a generator. The temperature differential at ground level versus my current elevation is approximately 9 degrees, which for a thermal column means the convection is active and variable, she said. Which means my shot geometry from the primary Overwatch changes. I need to account for a rising air column between the firing position and the loading platform. Yes, he said. Calculate the deflection range for a 700-yard shot through a rising thermal of 9 degrees differential at 45-degree angle of attack, she said. There was a pause. She could hear him working. Vertical drift component of approximately 6 to 8 inches upward, depending on the column's width. Width is hard to estimate from here. Could be 12 feet, could be 30. Best estimate, 20 feet, he said. Which means if Naomi is in the shot path and Doran is directly behind her, the upward drift works in our favor. It will push the shot high relative to standard ballistic drop. But if she's elevated relative to him, if she's on a step or a platform above him. The drift closes the gap, she said. I know. I need to see the angle myself. I need to be in position. She reached the overwatch position 4 minutes later, which was 90 seconds ahead of the planned timeline, a detail that Nolan acknowledged without comment by simply moving to his spotting position and beginning to feed her information before she had fully settled. She appreciated this. She appreciated people who understood that time spent on ceremony was time not spent on the problem. The loading platform was visible from the overwatch position at an angle that was both better and worse than the plan had assumed. Better because a slight westward shift in her approach had given her a cleaner line of sight over the crane infrastructure. Worse because the crane arm she had intended to use as a wind reference marker was at the wrong angle, which meant her secondary wind calculation method had to change. She adjusted. She began building her environmental picture from scratch, real-time, using what was actually in front of her rather than what the plan had told her would be there. This was the part of the work that she had never been able to fully explain to people who had not done it. The briefing room version and the actual version were always different. Always. The question was never whether they would differ, but by how much, and whether you had the mental flexibility to rebuild your approach in the space between what you planned and what you found without losing either your accuracy or your nerve. Holloway's voice came on the team net. Ground element is in position at the service junction, preparing for approach to primary structure. Hold, Brooke said immediately. A beat of silence on the net. In the old Holloway, the Holloway of 3 days ago, that silence would have been hostile. She heard this Holloway differently. She heard him hold and wait, which was itself an act that had cost him something. What do you have? He said. The heat shimmer above the service corridor, she said. It's breaking around a shape at approximately 30 meters inside the junction. The break pattern is too angular for a terrain feature. There is something in that corridor that is absorbing ambient heat differently than the surrounding structure. Another silence. Longer. Reflective camouflage, Nolan said quietly on the Overwatch channel. Has to be. Someone is in that corridor undercover. Confirmed, she said. Based on the outline of the shimmer interruption, I'm reading a single body-sized heat absorption pattern, prone or low crouch position. They've been there long enough to be ambient cool under the camouflage, which means they were pre-positioned. This was not a response to our approach. This was planned. They knew we were coming, Dylan said on the ground net, and his voice was controlled but stripped of its professional coating. The raw response of a man who has just understood that the ground he is standing on was chosen for him. Or they always have a shooter in that corridor, Brooke said. Doran's operational profile suggests layered pre-positioning. He doesn't react, he prepares. How do I take the corridor? Holloway said. You don't, she said. Not directly. The approach from the south service door adds 4 minutes to your timeline, but it approaches the corridor ambush position from behind. By the time the shooter realizes the primary approach is a redirect, your team is on their 6. 4 minutes puts us inside the vessel departure window. It puts us inside the departure window if Doran starts boarding now, she said. He hasn't started boarding yet. He's waiting for something. He's a patient man. Look at his vehicle pattern. He is still in the holding position, not moving toward the platform. Holloway said nothing for 3 seconds. You're reading his movement from the overwatch position. I'm reading his vehicle's heat signature from the overwatch position, she said. The engine is not running. He has not made his move to the ship yet. Another pause. She could feel the weight of it, the particular quality of the silence of a man who is deciding whether to trust another person's information with other people's lives. She had been on the other side of that silence before. She understood its cost. "South service door," Holloway said. "We redirect. Ward, take point on the south approach. Move on my mark." "Moving," Dillon said, and she heard the change in his footsteps on the net, purposeful and immediate. The 4 minutes stretched in the way time stretches, when nothing has gone wrong yet, but everything around you is preparing to. Brooke built her wind picture continuously reading the crane arm shadows, the surface of the water. She could see at the port edge the behavior of a strip of loose material she had identified on the facility's upper railing that served as a real-time wind flag at the midpoint of her shot path. Nolan called corrections at 90-second intervals with the quiet efficiency of a man who has committed himself fully to a role he had not planned to be in tonight and is choosing to be excellent at it regardless. "You doing all right?" he said in a gap between corrections. "Working," she said. "That's what I figured," he said. Then after a beat, "I'm glad you're here." She did not respond. But she registered it, filed it in the part of her that was not calculating environmental data, the part that was still after everything. A person who wanted to be in the right place, doing the right work with people who understood what that meant. The south approach succeeded. Holloway's team cleared the corridor junction from behind, neutralizing the ambush threat before the concealed shooter could reposition, and the operation moved into its second phase. But the corridor had cost them something. The sound of the team's approach, muffled as it had registered somewhere in Doran's awareness. She saw it in his vehicle's heat signature. The engine started. "He's moving," she said. "He made the vehicle, and he is moving toward the loading platform. You have 7 minutes before he's at the gangway." Holloway's voice came back with a compression in it that she recognized as controlled urgency. "Ground team is still 3 minutes from the primary structure. We will not reach the platform before he boards." "I know," she said. "Callahan." "I know," she said again. "Do not stop moving. I'll handle the platform." From his spotting position, Nolan turned his head toward her slightly. He did not speak. He understood what she had just said, and she understood that he understood, and neither of them wasted words on it. Her focus narrowed to the platform and what was coming toward it. Doran arrived at the loading platform with 4 men, and Naomi Vale and Brooke saw all of it through her scope, with the particular clarity that comes in moments when all the noise of the world drops away, and there is only the problem and the solution and the space between them. Naomi was upright and walking, which was the first thing Brooke registered. 22 days of captivity, and she was walking under her own control, which said something about her that Brooke added to everything else she had assembled about this woman from a distance. Doran had positioned himself immediately behind Naomi, with a hand on her left shoulder, which was the correct protective positioning for a man who understood Overwatch threats, and which told her that Doran had either military training himself or had been briefed by someone who did. He was not presenting a clean shot angle. He was giving her geometry that required either a miss or a miracle. She had no interest in miracles. Miracles were what happened when people ran out of preparation. She keyed her radio. "I have eyes on the target. Doran is in body shield positioning. I have a partial angle from my current position. I need Naomi to move." Holloway came back immediately. "How? The scope light," she said. "She's going to see the glint from my scope when I angle it. Signal language. I need her to understand what it means." She paused. "She's an engineer. She understands signal systems. Give me a moment." Nolan's voice was very quiet. "You're going to communicate with her through scope reflection. If she's paying attention," Brooke said, If she's trained herself to look for things in the middle of a situation that feels like it has no options, if she's the kind of person who doesn't stop looking even when looking feels pointless. She adjusted her angle. The scope caught the ambient light and threw a pattern toward the platform, short and deliberate. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. Then a sustained, steady point. On the platform, Naomi Vale's head turned 3 degrees to the left. Brooke's chest did not move. Her breathing was already controlled to the threshold of barely measurable. But something inside her went perfectly still in a way that was different from training stillness. The stillness of a person who has just made contact with another person across an impossible distance and needs that other person to understand. Naomi's left hand moved. A small movement, the kind that looks like a reflexive gesture to anyone watching who does not know what they are looking for. She pressed 2 fingers against her left thigh. She had seen the signal. She was acknowledging it. "She has eyes on me," Brooke said. "She understands. I need her to drop when I fire. She needs to get low." "How is she supposed to know when?" Nolan said. "The scope signal," Brooke said. 3 short pulses means get ready. When I angle away and back, she drops. "Brooke," Nolan said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she heard the weight in it. The weight of asking whether this was real, whether what she was trusting this woman to do was actually possible in the moment it needed to happen. "She's been waiting 22 days for a way out," Brooke said. "She will not miss this one." So began the final environmental calculation. Wind at the crane arm indicator west-northwest approximately 9 knots, sustained with gusts to 14. Thermal column above the secondary structure, still active, rising approximately 8 inches of vertical drift on a 700-yard shot at the current angle. Naomi's head was positioned at the left edge of Doran's shoulder line. The angle was not clean, but it was not impossible. It was the kind that required her to know exactly what the wind was doing, not at the moment of firing, but at the moment of arrival, to calculate not where the bullet was leaving from, but where the air was going to be when the bullet got there. "Wind call," she said. "Northwest at 11 sustained," Nolan said. "Gust cycle running approximately every 40 seconds. You are currently in the trough. Next gust in 22 seconds. Distance confirmation. 714 yards based on fixed reference triangulation. Thermal adds 8 inches high. Your aim point needs to be 8 inches low of the target to compensate." "Understood." She made the aim point adjustment. She breathed out. She let her heartbeat find its place in the rhythm of her body, counted it, found the space between beats that was the window. "Holloway," she said. "Ground element status." 2 minutes from the platform," Holloway said. "We need you to buy us 2 minutes." "I'm not buying time," she said. "I'm ending this." She paused. "Keep moving. Don't stop when you hear the shot." She sent the 3-pulse scope signal. On the platform, Naomi Vale's body went fractionally tense, in the way a person goes tense when they are about to do something that requires everything they have. Brooke angled the scope away, then back. Naomi dropped. She fired. The shot was in the air for a fraction of a second that Brooke felt as a full breath. The particular suspension of a moment that has been built from hundreds of calculations and one irreducible act of trust. Trust in the physics, trust in the numbers, trust in the person on the other end of the signal who had understood across 700 yards of hostile that this was the moment. The threat was neutralized before it registered its own ending. Doran's grip on Naomi's shoulder released, and she moved immediately away from him toward the facility wall, putting hard cover between herself and the remaining guards before Brooke had fully worked the bolt. "Target is clear," Brooke said. "Naomi is clear. Move." On the platform, sound erupted. Holloway's team hit the loading area from the south access, and the remaining guards made the decision that experienced people make when the tactical situation becomes irreversible. 3 of them chose the water. 1 chose to stay. He made that choice for approximately 4 seconds before Holloway's team resolved it. Doran was down, and the vessel was not going anywhere. Nolan's voice came on the Overwatch channel, and it was not the controlled professional voice of the last several hours. It was something rawer, something that had come up through the surface of all that careful competence. "Clean shot," he said. 714 yards, rising thermal, 11-knot crosswind. She was already working her bolt back, already moving to a secondary position in case of counterfire. "Confirmed target neutralized," she said. "Confirmed," he said. She breathed. "That," Nolan said, "is the best shot I have ever personally witnessed in 17 years in this work." She said nothing for a moment. She was thinking about Calvin, which she always did immediately after the way you think about the person who made something possible, when the thing they made possible has just happened. She thought about his voice, saying the final correction, the steadiness of it, the trust in it, the fact that he gave her that number, knowing what was coming, and choosing to give it anyway. "Thank your spotter," she said. Nolan was quiet for a beat. Then very quietly, "Yes, you should." Down on the platform, Holloway's voice came through with the particular controlled release of a commander whose team is alive, and the situation has resolved in the direction it needed to resolve. "Ground team secure. Naomi Vale is in our custody. She is ambulatory and responsive. We have the platform." Dylan Ward's voice came on immediately after, and she could hear something in it that was not professional composure, but was instead genuine, the response of a young man who has just watched something happen that he will spend the next several years thinking about. "Lieutenant Callahan," he said. "That was—" He stopped. Started again. "We're good. We're all good." "I know," she said. "Keep your head on the operation. It's not done." "Yes, Lieutenant," he said, and then "Yes, ma'am." She accepted that without comment, and went back to scanning the approach corridors for counter-movement, because the shot had been 1 moment, and this was still the operation, and the operation was not finished until every member of her team was off the platform and on the water and moving north. It took 11 more minutes to secure the facility perimeter, locate and begin extracting Naomi, and confirm the vessel was not going anywhere under its own power. 11 minutes during which Brooke maintained her overwatch position and Nolan maintained his spotting without either of them speaking beyond functional information exchange. They did not need to speak. The work had its own language, and they were both fluent in it now, which was a thing that had not been true 72 hours earlier and was completely true now. And the distance between those 2 states was a measure of something she had never been able to put a clean name to, but recognized every time she arrived at it. At the edge of the eastern ridge, with the extraction timeline running, and the first gray light beginning to show on the water to the north, Nolan Price packed his spotting equipment with the methodical care of a man who has spent 17 years learning to take care of his tools because his tools take care of his life. He worked in silence for a moment, and then he stopped. "Calvin Ross," he said. She looked up. "I was a good spotter," Nolan said. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement delivered carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else. "The best I've worked with," she said. "Until tonight," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. In the growing light, she could see that his face had shed most of the armor he had worn in that Falcon Ridge briefing room. Not all of it. Some of it was structural, built into him over decades, and it would not come down in 3 days. but enough that the person underneath was visible, and the person underneath was someone she thought she could work with for a very long time. "Tonight was close," she said. "Tonight was exceptional," he said. "Don't minimize it." "I'm not minimizing it," she said. "I'm keeping it accurate. Close is accurate. Close means I had the right information, and the right conditions, and the right spotter, and all of it together was enough. Change one of those things, and the outcome changes. Which is why the right spotter matters," he said. "Which is why the right spotter matters," she agreed. They finished packing. They moved toward the extraction point. Behind them, the abandoned port held its silence. The way places hold the memory of what has happened in them, without commentary, without judgment, as a simple fact of geography that some things had occurred here, and the ground had absorbed them, and the world had moved forward. The ground always moved forward. The question was only whether you were ready to move with it. The extraction craft was 40 minutes out from the facility when Naomi Vale finally stopped shaking. She had been shaking since the moment Holloway's team pulled her behind the cover of the facility wall, a fine tremor that ran through her hands and arms without reaching her face, because her face had been doing something entirely different. It had been holding itself in the controlled expression of a person who has decided that falling apart is something that happens later, when later is available, and for 22 days later had not been available. Brooke sat across from her in the extraction craft and watched the tremor slow and then stop. And then Naomi took one long breath through her nose and let it out through her mouth, and when she looked up, her eyes were clear. "You were on the ridge," Naomi said. It was not a question. "Yes?" Brooke said. "The scope signal. 3 pulses, then away, then back." Naomi's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that had been compressed for 22 days and was now beginning to decompress in the careful way of something that has been held under great pressure. "I spent 11 years designing signal routing systems. I know a coded sequence when I see one." "I counted on that," Brooke said. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. 700 yards at least." 714, Brooke. Naomi absorbed this. "I dropped at the right moment." "You dropped at exactly the right moment," Brooke said. Something moved through Naomi's face, then the controlled surface cracking in one specific place, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the water for a moment before she looked back. "I had decided 3 days ago that I was going to die there," she said quietly. "I had decided that I was not giving him the codes, and that the likely outcome of that decision was that I was not leaving. I had made my peace with it." She paused. "And then there was a light from the ridge." "You made the right choice," Brooke said. "Both choices. Not giving the codes and looking for the light. Were those choices going to save me without you?" Naomi said. "No," Brooke said. "But without your choices, my shot didn't work. We needed each other." Naomi looked at her with an expression that was careful and direct, and entirely without pretense, the look of someone who has been in a situation that stripped everything non-essential away and has not yet had time to put any of it back. "Who are you?" she said. "Lieutenant Brooke Callahan," she said. "I'm going to remember that name," Naomi said. Brooke did not respond to this with anything but a small nod, which was what the moment required. She looked back at the water and the darkness and let Naomi have the silence, because silence after 22 days of captivity is a gift in itself and does not need to be filled. Holloway was at the front of the extraction craft, with the team net still in his ear, managing the communication flow as the facility perimeter reports came back. She could see the set of his shoulders from where she sat, and she had learned in the last 4 days to read his posture the way she read terrain for information about what was happening inside the landscape. What she saw now was not the squared, controlled posture of a man managing a mission. It was something slightly more complicated, carrying something that had not been there when the operation began. He turned and looked at her across the length of the craft. She met his look. He held it for a moment, and then turned back to the water, and she understood that whatever needed to be said between them was not going to be said on the extraction craft in front of 8 other people, and she was fine with that. She had waited 6 years for certain conversations. She could wait another hour. The debrief took place at the forward operating location, a staging facility that was all function and no comfort in the way of places that exist entirely for the purpose of getting difficult things done. The intelligence team came in before the team had finished changing out of their gear, because intelligence people operate on their own timeline, which is always either very early or very late, and never once actually convenient. The documents recovered from the facility's secondary structure were the kind of thing that made intelligence officers stop typing and look up from their screens. Naomi walked the lead intelligence analyst through the communications data in a flat, precise voice that carried no drama but communicated absolute certainty. The voice of someone who built the system being described and therefore cannot be wrong about what any part of it does or means. Brooke sat against the far wall with her coffee and listened to every word. The network Doran had been operating was not simply a weapons smuggling channel. It was a coordinated infrastructure for supply route management across 3 maritime corridors, moving material for no fewer than 4 separate armed groups with intersecting interests and separate command structures. The communications encryption that Naomi had refused to unlock was the connective tissue of the entire operation. Without it, the 4 groups could not coordinate their timing, and without timing coordination, their supply chain collapsed into individual traceable transactions that could be interdicted independently. She held the whole thing shut, the intelligence analyst said, looking up from his screen at Naomi with an expression that was professional respect, trying not to become outright admiration. For 22 days. 23 by the time you're done briefing me, Naomi said without inflection. Holloway was standing at the edge of the briefing area when the analyst reached the section on Doran's network history, and Brooke saw the moment he went still. He was already still, he was always physically controlled, but this was a different quality of stillness, the kind that happens when a fact arrives that reorganizes something you thought you already understood. Say that again, he said to the analyst. The analyst looked up. The Kestrel Harbor operation 6 years ago. The ambush element that engaged the SEAL team in the approach corridor. The material that equipped that ambush came through Doran's network. He didn't pull the trigger himself, but he supplied the weapons, the communications, and the route coordination for the group that did. The room was very quiet. Brooke set her coffee down. She did not look at Holloway. She looked at the table in front of her and felt something move through her chest that was not grief exactly, because she had carried grief long enough to know its specific texture. And this was different. This was the particular sensation of a thing you have been holding in one hand, turning out to be a different shape than you thought. Not lighter, not heavier, but differently weighted, requiring a different kind of grip. Doran's network had supplied the people who killed Calvin Ross. Holloway turned toward her slowly. She still did not look up. She was aware of every person in the room becoming aware of this moment, in the specific way that people in rooms become aware of things that are personal and significant, and not theirs to intervene in. Callahan, Holloway said. She looked up then. His face was doing the thing she had seen it do once before, in the Nevada desert, when he first read her complete file. The recalibration of a man who has found out the story was different than he understood. But this version was worse. This version came with the understanding that the wrongness of the story had been built on something actively harmful, something Doran had constructed and profited from. "I know," she said. "You didn't know this," he said. "The Kestrel connection, this is new intelligence." "I knew Kestrel came from somewhere," she said. "I never knew where." He crossed to her side of the room. He pulled a chair from the table and sat across from her, which was not something she expected. Not the standing commander-to-operator posture, but something more direct, more human. The gesture of a man who has decided that the conversation he needs to have does not work at a distance. "Calvin's final report," he said quietly. "I want to talk to you about it." She kept her expression level. "All right. I read it 6 years ago when it came in," he said. "And then I read it again last night when I pulled everything connected to your file. It is—" He stopped. He was choosing words with the care he brought to things that required precision, and she found she could wait for him to find them. "He wrote it knowing he was not going to make it out," Holloway said. "The medical report puts his wound at unsurvivable within 20 minutes of the shot. He wrote the report in that window." She knew this. She had known it for 18 months since she first read the report. She had known it, and had not told anyone. Because it was Calvin's, it belonged to him, and she was not going to pass his final 20 minutes around like a briefing document. "He wrote about the shot," Holloway said. "He wrote about the wind correction he gave you, and why he gave it at that moment. He said—" Holloway paused again, and this pause was different from the precision pause. This was a man who is moved and has made the adult decision to be moved rather than perform composure at the cost of honesty. "He said he gave you the correction because you had already built the picture. He said his job in that moment was just to confirm what you already knew. He said you were the calmest person on that ridge. Something happened in Brooke's chest that she chose not to name. She breathed through it. He asked command not to make you carry his death," Holloway said. "Specifically, he wrote it that way. He said, do not allow her to carry this as a failure, because it was not a failure. It was the best anyone has ever done in those conditions, and if you hold it against her, or let her hold it against herself, you will waste the most valuable asset you have." The room around them had been completely silent for a while now. She was peripherally aware of Nolan Price, standing near the doorway, with his arms crossed, not in the defensive posture of the Falcon Ridge briefing room, but in the posture of a man who is holding himself still, because what he is watching matters, and he does not want to interrupt it. Dylan Ward was at the table and had stopped pretending to look at his notes. Naomi Vale was very still against the far wall. Brooke looked at Holloway. "You knew this 6 years ago," she said. "Not an accusation. A fact." "Yes," he said. "And when they assigned me to Falcon Ridge, the assignment crossed my desk with Calvin's citation attached," he said. "I still questioned it. I still made my assumptions." He held her gaze. "I did not deserve the file I was given, and I did not live up to it. I want you to know that I understand that. Not because I expect it to change anything, but because you have a right to hear it said plainly." She looked at him for a long time. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system and the distant sounds of the facility operating around them. The ordinary sounds of a world that had kept moving through the last 22 days of captivity and the last 4 days of what she and this team had built in the Nevada desert, and the 6 years she had been carrying something that Calvin had specifically asked her not to carry. "9 men came home," she said finally. "9 men came home," he said. "Calvin asked me once before Kestrel what I thought the job was actually for," she said. "Not the mission, not the objective, the job itself. What is it for?" She paused. "I told him it was for the people who can't do it themselves. He said no. He said it's for the person next to you. He said everything else is downstream of that." She looked at Holloway. "He was usually right." Holloway nodded slowly. Then he straightened, and the commander came back into his bearing, but it was different now. Something had been adjusted in the architecture of it. "I owe this team a conversation," he said at a volume that included everyone in the room. "And I'm going to have it." He stood and turned to face the full room. He stood there for a moment without speaking, looking at each person in turn with the particular attention of someone who is making sure that what they are about to say lands in the right place. Then he began. "4 days ago, I stood in a briefing room and allowed this team to laugh at a colleague," he said. "I did not laugh myself, which I have told myself is a distinction that matters. It does not matter. Leadership that permits contempt and leadership that performs contempt arrive at the same place. I permitted it. That is on me." The room held very still. "Lieutenant Callahan's gender was never relevant to this operation," Holloway said. "Her record was relevant. Her skills were relevant. Her history with this specific mission environment was relevant, and it turns out, given what we now know about Doran's network and its connection to Kestrel, more relevant than any of us understood when we began. What was not relevant was what she looked like, or who we expected her to be before she walked through the door." He paused. "We made assumptions. We dressed them up as professional standards and called them caution, and what they actually were was the comfortable shortcut of men who have decided the work is already settled." Dylan Ward looked at the table. His jaw was tight. She watched him absorb it and choose not to deflect it. Nolan Price had not moved from the doorway. His arms were still crossed, but the expression on his face was the expression of a man hearing something true about himself, said in public, which is always more expensive than hearing it privately, and he was paying the full price without looking for a way to make change. "This is not a conversation about policy," Holloway said. "I do not want anyone in this room to hear it as administrative language. This is me telling you directly because you were there that I was wrong about how I ran that room and that the standard I held in that briefing room is not the standard I am holding from this point forward." He looked at Brooke. "Lieutenant Callahan has earned her place on this team by any measure I am willing to apply. She earned it before we started the evaluation. The evaluation was for my benefit, not hers." Brooke said nothing. She did not need to say anything. What Holloway was doing was something she had not asked for, and something she would not have requested, because she had learned long ago that making someone acknowledge their wrong behavior was less useful than simply continuing to be good enough that the behavior became impossible to sustain. But he was doing it anyway, without being asked, because it was right, and she found she had more respect for him in this moment than at any point in the 4 days she had been watching him work. Nolan uncrossed his arms and walked to the center of the room. He stopped near the table, equidistant from Brooke and Holloway, and he looked at her directly with the same stripped-down expression she had seen on the ridge. "I owe you more than a professional apology," he said. "I said what I said in that briefing room because I was afraid. Not of you specifically. Afraid of what it would mean if someone I'd decided wasn't qualified turned out to be better at my job than I've allowed myself to consider. That's not an excuse. That's just what was true, and I think you deserve to know the actual thing rather than a cleaned-up version of it." Something in the room shifted the way it had shifted in the Nevada desert when the laughter first stopped and the professional honesty started, but deeper now, further through the surface. "Chief Price," Brooke said, "you gave me the best wind correction I have received since Calvin Ross. At a moment when the margin was exactly as small as it needed to be, and you did not hesitate. That tells me what I need to know about who you are when the performance stops." He looked at her. He nodded once, and it was not a social nod. It was the acknowledgement of one professional to another that something has been said and received and understood. Dylan Ward looked up from the table. His voice was slightly unsteady in the way of someone whose throat has tightened. But he spoke anyway, which Brooke was beginning to understand was the most characteristic thing about him. He did the uncomfortable thing when he understood it was the right thing, even when his voice wasn't quite ready to do it. "I laughed," he said. "In the briefing room. I laughed because the person next to me laughed, and I did not want to be the one who didn't. And then you told me about my suppressor, and I went and checked it. And I keep thinking about what would have happened in that afternoon session if you hadn't said anything. Not just to me. If a round had let go at the wrong moment in the wrong direction." He stopped. "You looked out for me before I gave you a single reason to." "That's the job," Brooke said. "Looking out for the person next to you, regardless of whether they've earned it yet. Calvin taught me that." Dylan absorbed this. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "Do something useful with it. That's all I'm asking." Naomi Vale, who had been silent against the far wall through all of this, said very quietly, "For what it's worth, from the platform side of tonight, the right people were on that ridge." The room held that for a moment. Then Holloway cleared his throat, and the commander reasserted itself in the practical way of a man who understands that meaningful moments do not improve with extension. "Intelligence team," he said. "I want a full breakdown of the Doran network documentation within 6 hours. Cross-reference everything with the Kestrel Harbor file and flag every connection point. This network is larger than one operation, and we just hit the edge of it, not the center." He turned to the team. "Rest period is 4 hours. Debrief resumes at 0600. I want everyone sharp." People began to move. The room came back to its operational rhythm, the rhythm of people who have a great deal of work still in front of them and have learned to put the weight of the preceding moments down, not because the weight isn't real, but because you cannot carry it, and also do the work, and the work is what you are here for. Brooke stayed at the table after most of the others had moved. She had her notebook open, which she had carried through the operation, and the extraction, and the debrief, and she was writing. Not the mission notes, not the environmental calculations, or the shot data. She was writing something else, the kind of writing she did when a day had contained too much to leave unrecorded. Not because she would read it again, but because putting it on paper was how she let it be real, rather than carrying it as something that had happened somewhere in the space between what was remembered and what was imagined. She wrote Calvin's name at the top of the page. She sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote Doran's network supplied Kestrel. 6 years to know the shape of the thing you already survived. She wrote 9 men came home. This was always the real number. She wrote Nolan gave me the correction, and didn't hesitate. I will not forget that. She wrote, Naomi dropped at exactly the right moment because she had spent 22 days refusing to give up and 1 second deciding to trust a light from a ridge. That is the whole story of courage in 1 moment. She closed the notebook. Outside the briefing room, she could hear Dylan's voice and Nolan's voice talking in the corridor. Not debriefing, just talking, the casual, overlapping speech of 2 people who have been through something together and are finding out in real time how to be on the same side of it. The sound of it was ordinary in the way that truly important things always sound ordinary when you catch them happening. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and did not replace it. She sat for another minute in the quiet room, with the weight of the day settling into its proper place, which was not the past exactly, not the present exactly, but that particular layer of experience that becomes part of the structure of who you are, not something you carry, but something you become. Somewhere in a file she would never personally read, Calvin Ross's final report was sitting in an archive, and in it, he had asked the people who came after him to not reduce her to just the medic, to give her the full scope of what she was capable of, to let her be everything she had prepared herself to be. He had asked this in the last 20 minutes of his life, with a wound that left him no options except that one. She had spent 6 years trying to deserve that request. Looking at the empty room around her, at the papers on the table, and the maps on the wall, and the evidence of an operation that had by every measure that mattered gone right, she thought for the first time in 6 years that maybe she had finally gotten there, not because of the shot. The shot was the last 10 seconds of everything that came before it. It was the preparation and the patience and the decision to stay in the room, even when the room did not want her to keep knowing what she knew, even when no one around her was ready to listen, to look for the danger before anyone else thought to look. That was the job. That had always been the job. Calvin had known it before she fully understood it. He had known what she was capable of in the space between a wind correction and a goodbye, and he had used his last breath to make sure someone wrote it down. She stood, picked up her gear, and walked toward the door. The corridor was ordinary and fluorescent, and exactly as unglamorous as every corridor in every military facility she had ever worked in, and she walked through it with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything, the certainty not of someone who has nothing left to prove, but of someone who finally understands that what she is proving for all the right reasons. 3 months after the Red Sea Falcon Ridge looked the same from the outside. The buildings were still the same concrete and function. The desert still ran flat and bright in every direction. The range still kicked up dust when the afternoon wind changed, and the briefing room still smelled like burnt coffee and hard chairs. But Brooke Callahan had been in enough places to know that a space could hold the same geography and be an entirely different place, and Falcon Ridge was an entirely different place. She knew it the morning she walked into the building and heard laughter coming from the briefing room and felt nothing clench in her chest. 3 months ago, that sound had meant something specific. Now it meant what laughter is supposed to mean: people who are comfortable enough with each other to find something funny before the work begins. She registered this without stopping, the way you register something that has become ordinary, and she carried her coffee down the hall to the training coordination office and sat down at the desk that was now hers. The second look protocol had been formalized into Falcon Ridge's operational framework 6 weeks after the Red Sea operation. Holloway had written the order himself, which Brooke had not expected, and which he had not announced in advance. He placed it on her desk one morning without ceremony and said, "Read it. Tell me what I got wrong." She read it. He had gotten nothing wrong. She told him so, and something in his face shifted in the way of a man who has worked hard on something and is relieved to hear it holds. The protocol was simple in the way that the best things are simple. Any member of a team, regardless of rank, could call a temporary halt to an operation or training exercise by presenting observable physical evidence of an overlooked risk, not a feeling, not a preference, observable evidence. The halt lasted exactly as long as it took to examine the evidence and make a decision based on it. Nobody lost rank for calling it. Nobody lost credibility for calling it and being wrong, provided the evidence was real and the observation was genuine. What you lost credibility for was ignoring it. It was in essence the thing Brooke had been practicing her entire career before anyone gave it a name. Nolan Price was the one who taught it to new operators, which had not been part of any formal plan but had become the obvious arrangement within the first 2 weeks. He taught it the way he taught everything now, with the directness of someone who has gone through the experience of being wrong about something important and has decided that the most useful thing he can do with that experience is make it available to people who have not been wrong yet as a kind of advance payment against the mistakes they will inevitably make. She heard him through the wall sometimes running a new class, and she had learned to distinguish his teaching voice from his operational voice. The teaching voice was slower, more patient, and carried something in it that had not been there before, a particular quality of honesty that came from a man who had stopped performing certainty and started demonstrating it instead. "The reason you call it is not because you're sure," she heard him say one morning. "You call it because the evidence is there, and the cost of being wrong about calling it is lower than the cost of being wrong about not calling it. That's the whole calculation. Everything else is noise. She went back to her paperwork and did not interrupt him. Dylan Ward had been assigned to a cross-training program that rotated operators through multiple specialty roles, which was a program that did not exist before. Brooke proposed it to Holloway in a 2-page memo the week after they returned from the Red Sea. The memo was careful and specific and built its argument from operational data rather than principle, because she had learned that Holloway responded to evidence the way a good lock responds to the right key immediately without resistance once you had the right shape. Dylan was predictably excellent in the cross-training program. She watched him in the field exercises and saw the young man who had laughed in the briefing room and the young operator who had called his breach timing cleanly in the Red Sea operation, existing in the same person simultaneously, which was how growth actually worked, not by replacing what was there, but by adding to it layer by layer until the original shape was still present, but was no longer the whole story. He came to her office 3 weeks into the program and stood in the doorway in the way he always did now, which was the posture of someone who has learned that entering a room uninvited is a choice rather than a default. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're already in the doorway," she said without looking up from the range report she was annotating. "Ask." "The suppressor," he said. "The first day at Falcon Ridge. You noticed it when I was pulling equipment. We hadn't spoken. You didn't know anything about me except that I'd laughed with the rest of them." He paused. "Why did you tell me?" She set the pen down. "Because it was dangerous and you didn't see it," she said. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing," she said. "The job is to see the danger and say something about it. I don't get to decide who deserves the warning based on whether they've been kind to me. The warning is for everyone or it's for no one." He stood with that for a moment. "I've been thinking about that a lot," he said. "About what you said to something useful with the apology. I've been trying to figure out what that looks like in practice." "What have you come up with?" she said. "I stop before I decide," he said. "I catch myself making the automatic assessment, the 4-second judgment you talked about in the debrief, and I stop and ask what I actually know versus what I'm assuming, and then I stay in the observation longer." He paused. "It's harder than it sounds." "Yes," she said. "It is." "Does it get easier?" She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "But you get better at doing it hard, which is worth more." He nodded and left, and she went back to the range report, and she noted without making it a large thing in her mind that Dylan Ward was going to be a very good operator in about 5 years, and a remarkable one in 10, and that the only thing standing between him and that outcome was the accumulated weight of the choices he was already making. Naomi Vale came to Falcon Ridge once 7 weeks after the operation. It was not an official visit. She came as she explained to Brooke over the phone 2 days before because she wanted to see the ridge. Not the facility. The ridge. The specific elevated position from which a shot had been fired at 03:47 hours on a night when she had decided she was not going to survive. Brooke drove her out herself. They did not bring anyone else. They parked at the base of the eastern approach and climbed together, and Naomi was in better physical condition than Brooke had expected, which she mentioned. "I started running again 2 weeks after I got back," Naomi said. "I needed to feel my legs working correctly. 22 days of limited movement does something to your relationship with your body." "I can imagine," Brooke said. "Can you?" Naomi said, and it was not hostile. It was a genuine question from a scientist who wanted accurate data. Brooke thought about the 200 yards she had carried Calvin through incoming fire, with her lungs burning and her legs asking her to stop, and the answer being that there was no option but to keep going. "Somewhat," she said. But Naomi nodded. They climbed in silence for a while. The desert was quiet in the way of late morning past the cool of the early hours, and not yet into the full weight of afternoon heat. At the top of the ridge, Naomi stood for a long time, looking at the terrain below them. Not the facility, the actual topography, the shape of the ground, the way the distance laid itself out. Brooke stood beside her and did not speak, because Naomi did not seem to need anything said. 714 yards, Naomi said finally. Yes. And a thermal column, and crosswind. Yes. And me not knowing exactly what the signal meant, but understanding that it meant something. Yes, Brooke said. Naomi turned to look at her. I want to ask you something that may be too personal. Ask it, Brooke said. Were you afraid? Naomi said. At the moment, when you fired. Brooke thought about this with the honesty it deserved. No, she said. I was not afraid at this moment. I had done the preparation, and I trusted the preparation. What I was is present. Everything reduced to the immediate problem and the specific solution. Fear lives in the space between what you've prepared for and what you're facing. If the preparation is complete, there's very little room for it. That is one of the most useful things anyone has ever said to me, Naomi said. Calvin taught it to me, Brooke said. Not in those words. He taught it the way he taught everything, by demonstrating it. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Your spotter, she said. Yes. He was on that ridge with you at Kestrel 6 years ago. He was, Brooke said. Naomi looked back out at the terrain. I have been thinking about something since the platform. About the specific kind of courage that is required to trust someone else's signal in a moment when everything in you is already maxed out. She paused. I spent 22 days deciding what I would and would not give up. That required a kind of courage. But what you asked of me on the platform was a different kind. The kind that says, trust this right now, with no time to think and no additional information. She looked at Brooke. That is the hardest kind. You did it, Brooke said. I did it because the alternative was not doing it, Naomi said, which is perhaps not quite the same as being brave. That is exactly the same as being brave, Brooke said. Brave is not doing something because you feel certain about it. It's doing something because the cost of not doing it is too high. The feeling of certainty is beside the point. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Brooke did not expect. I want to put your name in a report, she said. The official debrief I've been asked to write for the State Department and the Maritime Authority. I want to include not just what happened on the platform, but how it happened. The signal system, the preparation, the approach. She paused. I want people to know it was a woman on that ridge, and I want that to be in the official record, not the footnote. The record will reflect the operation, Brooke said carefully. The operational record will use rank designations and mission codes, Naomi said. I am writing a human account. I want your name in it. Brooke looked at the terrain below them. The same terrain she had been looking at from this position a little over 7 weeks earlier in the dark building. An environmental picture from shadow angles and wind flags, and one strip of loose material on a railing. She thought about Calvin's report, sitting in a sealed archive, his name attached to a document that had asked commanders not to reduce her. She thought about what it means for a name to be attached to a thing for a record, to say that a specific person did a specific thing, and that the specific person mattered to the outcome. Put it in the report, she said. Naomi nodded once with the decisive quality of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. The new training cycle began on a Monday in the 4th month. and it brought with it a group of candidates that were in the way of every new group of candidates everywhere, both exactly like every group that had come before them, and completely different in ways that would only become visible over time. Brooke had learned to hold both of these things simultaneously, which was a skill she had developed in her years of working with people, and which she considered one of the most practically useful things she knew how to do. She was not in the briefing room when the first session began. She was in the equipment room reviewing the rangefinder calibration logs from the previous week's training exercise, because the rangefinder calibration logs required review, and she was not going to assign that task to someone else, simply because it was mundane. The mundane things were often where the critical information lived, and she had learned this lesson too many times to require repeating. She heard the session through the wall, in the way she heard most things at Falcon Ridge now as background information that she filed alongside everything else, tracking it without directing her full attention to it until her full attention was required. The session had been running for approximately 12 minutes when she heard the laughter. It was not loud. It was the specific quality of laughter that begins low, that starts in one or two people, and tests the room, reaching for permission to become general. She had heard this exact sound before. She knew its architecture. She set the calibration log on the table and walked to the briefing room door and opened it. The room held 8 new candidates and Nolan Price at the front, and a young woman standing at the far end of the table with a rifle case that she had just set down. And the laughter was coming from 2 of the male candidates near the center of the room, who had looked at the rifle case and the woman carrying it, and made the 4-second calculation that Brooke had spent 4 months building a protocol to interrupt. She did not step into the room. Nolan had already stopped moving. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the 2 candidates who were laughing, and the look was not angry. It was not performative. It was the look of a man who has been exactly where those 2 candidates are sitting and has made a decision somewhere over the last 4 months that the version of himself who sat in that chair is not a version he is willing to produce again. "Something funny," he said. The laughter stopped. Nolan did not look at the young woman at the far end of the table. He looked at the 2 candidates who had laughed, and he held that look with the patience of someone who understands that silence is a teaching tool when used correctly. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, because the honest answer is the only one that's worth anything in this room." He paused. "What do you actually know about the operator standing at that end of the table?" One of the 2 candidates, the one who had laughed louder, shifted in his chair. "Nothing," he said, and to his credit he said it with the beginning of understanding rather than defensiveness, as though the act of being asked the question had created a small opening in the certainty he had walked in with. "Nothing," Nolan said. "You know nothing, and you already made a decision." He let that sit for a moment. In this work, making decisions on nothing gets people killed. I know that because I have watched it happen. I know that because I have done it myself. He paused. You are going to spend the next 2 weeks learning to separate what you observe from what you assume. The distinction between those 2 things is the most important thing I am going to teach you here. Everything else is technique. He turned to the young woman at the end of the table. She was 26 or 27, with the contained posture of someone who has been in rooms that did not want them before, and has developed the particular self-possession that comes from continuing to stand in those rooms anyway. "I'm Chief Price," he said. "Welcome to Falcon Ridge." He paused. "What do you see that we don't?" The young woman looked at him for a moment, reading the question, and something in her expression shifted from the guarded readiness she had brought into the room to something more direct. "The rangefinder on the equipment shelf behind you," she said. "The calibration indicator light is amber. It should be green. Either the battery is low or the internal calibration has drifted. Either way, if someone uses that unit this week without checking it, they will get false distance readings, and any shot they fire based on those readings will miss." The room was very quiet. Nolan turned and looked at the rangefinder on the shelf behind him. He picked it up. He looked at the calibration indicator. He set it back down. "Good eye," he said. Brooke, standing in the doorway, looked at the rangefinder on the shelf. She had reviewed the calibration logs 20 minutes earlier. The unit had been flagged. She had made a note to pull it before the session. She had been pulled away by the sound of laughter before she completed the task. She looked at the young woman at the end of the table, who had seen what Brooke already knew, and had said it out loud in a room that had just laughed at her. Something moved through Brooke's chest that she recognized this time without needing to name it. It was the feeling of a thing completing its circle, not ending, but arriving back at its beginning from a direction that only made sense from the far side of the journey. She stepped back from the doorway before anyone turned around. She returned to the equipment room. She picked up her calibration log and entered the note about the flagged rangefinder and marked the unit for immediate service doing it properly. Properly this time, all the way to the end, because the mundane things matter, and the ending of a task matters as much as its beginning. Through the wall, she heard Nolan's voice running the session, and after a few minutes, she heard the young woman's voice responding to a technical question with the kind of precision that comes from preparation rather than performance, and she heard the room receive it in a way that was different from how rooms had received Brooke's voice at the beginning of any of this. Not perfect, not transformed overnight, but different. Measurably, genuinely different. She thought about Calvin. She thought about the weight of him, and the steadiness of his voice, and the fact that he had used his last 20 minutes to write a report that asked people not to reduce her to the smallest version of what she was. She thought about what it means to be reduced, and what it means to be given the full scope of what you are capable of, and how the distance between those two things is sometimes the difference between a life that matters and a life that is never permitted to show that it does. She thought about Holloway, standing in front of his team, saying the thing he needed to say. She thought about Nolan on the ridge at 0347 hours, giving a wind correction without hesitation and using her name for the first time. She thought about Dylan catching himself at the 4-second mark and choosing to stay in the observation. She thought about Naomi dropping at exactly the right moment because she had spent 22 days refusing to surrender what she knew and 1 second deciding to trust a light. She thought about what it had cost all of it and whether the cost had been worth the arrival. She decided without drama and without ceremony that it had. Not because she had been vindicated. Vindication was a small thing, and she had never been interested in small things. But because something had shifted in the architecture of this place that would outlast her specific presence in it. Something that the next quiet person to walk through that door would benefit from, without ever knowing the name of the woman who built the foundation under it. That was the real work. That had always been the real work. Not the shot anyone who was trained well enough and had enough nerve could make a shot under the right conditions. The real work was the thing that happened before and after the shot. The preparation and the transmission, the passing forward of what you knew to the people who came after you, so they did not have to learn it entirely from scratch in conditions that did not give them room for the learning curve. Holloway appeared in the doorway of the equipment room at the end of the morning session. He looked at the calibration log on the table in front of her. "Rangefinder is flagged," he said. "Already in the log," she said. "Pulled it for service." "The new candidate caught it," he said. "Yes," she said. He leaned against the doorframe. "What did you think of her?" "I think she's going to be excellent," Brooke said. I think she's going to need someone to give her the room to demonstrate it without having to fight for the right to be seen first. I think if she gets that room, this team gets something valuable. She looked at Holloway. I think the protocol exists precisely for people like her. He nodded. I assigned Nolan to be her primary evaluator, he said. I know, she said. I heard him run the opening session. He's different, Holloway said. Not a question. He's better, she said. He was always capable of it. He just needed the friction. We all needed the friction, Holloway said, and his voice carried something in it that was not quite humility, which was too soft a word for what Holloway was capable of, but was the harder-edged version of it accountability that had passed through the system and come out the other side as changed behavior rather than changed rhetoric. The second look protocol, she said. Have you heard back from the evaluation board? Approved for pilot deployment across 3 additional units, he said. Starting next quarter. They want you to present the framework at the Regional Training Summit in the spring. She looked at him. Your name on the documentation, he said. Your framework, your presentation. Non-negotiable. She thought about Naomi's voice on the ridge, saying she wanted Brooke's name in the report. She thought about Calvin's report in the archive, with his name on a document that fought for her. She thought about the long chain of people who had put their names on things, so that the things would matter, and the names would travel, and the distance between the moment of origin and the moment of impact would be bridged by the simple fact of attribution. All right, she said. Good, he said. He straightened and turned to leave, then stopped. Callahan. Commander. What you built here, he said. In 4 months. What you built in the years before you got here that made the 4 months possible. He paused in the way. He paused when something required precision. It matters. I want you to know that I understand how much it cost, and I understand what it's worth. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was flat and practical, and the equipment room was exactly as unglamorous as every space she had ever worked in, and Grant Holloway was standing in a doorway saying the truest thing he had said to her in 4 months of true things. Thank you, she said, not deflecting, not minimizing, just receiving it the way things that are offered honestly deserve to be received. He left. She turned back to the calibration log. Through the wall, the training session continued. Nolan's voice, and 8 other voices, and 1 voice in particular that was finding its footing in a room that was for the first time actually ready to let it. Brooke Callahan picked up her pen and finished the log all the way to the last line, because that was what the work required. And she had always known that the work required everything, and she had always been willing to give it. And that willingness, more than any shot, more than any classified file, more than any 4 words spoken into a room that had already decided it was laughing, was the truest thing about her. The world would remember one shot from a ridge above a Red Sea port at 0347 hours on a night when everything was against it. But what Brooke Callahan had actually built line by line and day by day was a world that knew how to listen before it was too late. And that was the victory no single shot could ever equal, and no 4-second judgment could ever take away.